Atlantis in Plato's writings. Critias. One. Hence we may safely conclude that the entire narrative is due to the imagination of Plato, who has used the name of Solon and introduced the Egyptian priests to give verisimilitude to his story. To the Greeks, such a tale, like that of the earth-born men, would have seemed perfectly accordant with the character of his mythology and not more marvelous than the wonders of the East narrated by Herodotus and others. He might have been deceived into believing it. But it appears strange that later ages should have been imposed upon by the fiction. As many attempts have been made to find the great island of Atlantis as to discover the country of the lost tribes. Without regard to the description of Plato, and without a suspicion that the whole narrative is a fabrication, interpreters have looked for the spot in every part of the globe: America, Arabia Felix, Ceylon Palestine, Sardinia Sweden. Timaeus concludes with a prayer that his words may be acceptable to the God whom he has revealed, and Critias, whose turn follows, begs that a larger measure of indulgence may be conceded to him, because he has to speak of men whom we know, and not of gods whom we do not know. 2. Critias returns to his story, professing only to repeat what Solon was told by the priests. The war of which he was about to speak had occurred 9,000 years ago. One of the combatants was the city of Athens, the other was the great island of Atlantis. Critias proposes to speak of these rival powers first of all, giving to Athens the precedence. The various tribes of Greeks and barbarians who took part in the war will be dealt with as they successively appear on the scene. In the beginning, the gods agreed to divide the earth by lot in a friendly manner, and when they had made the allotment they settled their several countries and were the shepherds, or rather the pilots of mankind, whom they guided by persuasion and not by force. 3. And so they passed their lives as guardians of the citizens and leaders of the Hellenes. They were a just and famous race, celebrated for their beauty and virtue all over Europe and Asia. And now I will speak to you of their adversaries, but first I ought to explain that the Greek names were given to Solon in an Egyptian form, and he inquired their meaning and translated them. His manuscript was left with my grandfather Dropides, and is now in my possession. In the division of the earth Poseidon obtained as his portion the island of Atlantis, and there he begat children whose mother was a mortal. Towards the sea, and in the center of the island there was a very fair and fertile plain, and near the center, about 50 stadia from the plain, there was a low mountain in which dwelt a man named Evener and his wife Leucippe, and their daughter Cleito, of whom Poseidon became enamored. He, to secure his love, enclosed the mountain with rings or zones varying in size, 2 of land and 3 of sea, which his divine power readily enabled him to excavate and fashion, and, as there was no shipping in those days, no man could get into the place. 4. When night came, they put on azure robes and gave judgment against offenders. The most important of their laws related to their dealings with one another. They were not to take up arms against one another and were to come to the rescue if any of their brethren were attacked. They were to deliberate in common about war, and the king was not to have the power of life and death over his kinsmen unless he had the assent of the majority. For many generations, as tradition tells, the people of Atlantis were obedient to the laws and to the gods and practiced gentleness and wisdom in their intercourse with one another. They knew that they could only have the true use of riches by not caring about them. But gradually the divine portion of their souls became diluted with too much of the mortal admixture, and they began to degenerate, though to the outward eye they appeared glorious as ever at the very time when they were filled with all iniquity. 5. The old epic poetry. 4. The ingenious reason assigned for the Greek names occurring in the Egyptian tale. 5. The remark that the armed statue of Athena indicated the common warrior life of men and women. 6. The particularity with which the third deluge before that of Deucalion is affirmed to have been the Great Destruction. 7. The happy guess that great geological changes have been effected by water. 8. The indulgence of the prejudice against sailing beyond the columns and the popular belief of the shallowness of the ocean in that part. 9. The confession that the depth of the ditch in the island of Atlantis was not to be believed, and yet he could only repeat what he had heard, compared with the statement made in an earlier passage that Poseidon, being a god, found no difficulty in contriving the water supply of the center island. 10. The mention of the old rivalry of Poseidon and Athene, and the creation of the first inhabitants out of the soil. Plato here, as elsewhere, ingeniously gives the impression that he is telling the truth which mythology had corrupted. The world, like a child, has readily, and for the most part unhesitatingly, accepted the tale of the island of Atlantis. In modern times we hardly seek for traces of the submerged continent, but even Mr. Grote is inclined to believe in the Egyptian poem of Solon, of which there is no evidence in antiquity, while others, like Martin, discuss the Egyptian origin of the legend, or like M. de Humboldt, whom he quotes, are disposed to find in it a vestige of a widely spread tradition. Others, adopting a different vein of reflection, regard the island of Atlantis as the anticipation of a still greater island, the continent of America. The tale, says M. Martin, rests upon the authority of the Egyptian priests, and the Egyptian priests took a pleasure in deceiving the Greeks. He never appears to suspect that there is a greater deceiver or magician than the Egyptian priests, that is to say, Plato himself, from the dominion of whose genius the critic and natural philosopher of modern times are not wholly emancipated. 6. In contrasting the small Greek city numbering about 20,000 inhabitants with the barbaric greatness of the island of Atlantis, Plato probably intended to show that a state, such as the ideal Athens, was invincible, though matched against any number of opponents. Cp. Rep. Even in a great empire there might be a degree of virtue and justice, such as the Greeks believed to have existed under the sway of the first Persian kings. But all such empires were liable to degenerate and soon incurred the anger of the gods. Their oriental wealth and splendor of gold and silver and variety of colors seemed also to be at variance with the simplicity of Greek notions. In the island of Atlantis, Plato is describing a sort of Babylonian or Egyptian city, to which he opposes the frugal life of the true Hellenic citizen. It is remarkable that in his brief sketch of them, he idealizes the husbandmen who are lovers of honor and true husbandmen, as well as the warriors who are his sole concern in the Republic, and that though he speaks of the common pursuits of men and women, he says nothing of the community of wives and children. 7. And now, making no more excuses, I will proceed. Let me begin by observing first of all that 9,000 was the sum of years which had elapsed since the war which was said to have taken place between those who dwelt outside the pillars of Heracles and all who dwelt within them. This war one I'm going to describe. Of the combatants on the one side, the city of Athens was reported to have been the leader and to have fought out the war. The combatants on the other side were commanded by the kings of Atlantis, which, as I was saying, was an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia, and when afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. The progress of the history will unfold the various nations of barbarians and families of Hellenes which then existed, as they successively appear on the scene, but I must describe first of all the Athenians of that day and their enemies who fought with them, and then the respective powers and governments of the two kingdoms. Let us give the precedence to Athens. 8. My great-grandfather, Dropides, had the original writing, which is still in my possession, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. Therefore if you hear names such as are used in this country, you must not be surprised, for I have told how they came to be introduced. The tale, which was of great length, began as follows. I have before remarked in speaking of the allotments of the gods that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent and made for themselves temples and instituted sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman and settled them in a part of the island, which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but in the center of the whole island, there was a plain which is said to have been the fairest of all plains and very fertile. Near the plain again, and also in the center of the island at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain not very high on any side. In this mountain there dwelt one of the earth-born primeval men of that country, whose name was Evener, and he had a wife named Lucip, and they had an only daughter who was called Cleito. 9. He himself, being a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center island, bringing up 2 springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warm water and the other of cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly from the soil. He also begat and brought up 5 pairs of twin male children, and dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions, he gave to the firstborn of the eldest pair his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment, which was the largest and best, and made him king over the rest. The others he made princes, and gave them rule over many men, and a large territory. And he named them all. The eldest, who was the first king, he named Atlas, and after him the whole island and the ocean were called Atlantic. To his twin brother, who was born after him, and obtained as his lot the extremity of the island towards the pillars of Heracles, facing the country which is now called the region of Gades in that part of the world, he gave the name which in the Hellenic language. 10. There were many special laws affecting the several kings inscribed about the temples, but the most important was the following: they were not to take up arms against one another, and they were all to come to the rescue if anyone in any of their cities attempted to overthrow the royal house. Like their ancestors, they were to deliberate in common about war and other matters, giving the supremacy to the descendants of Atlas. And the king was not to have the power of life and death over any of his kinsmen, unless he had the assent of the majority of the 10. Such was the vast power which the god settled in the lost island of Atlantis, and this he afterwards directed against our land for the following reasons, as tradition tells. For many generations, as long as the divine nature lasted in them, they were obedient to the laws and well affection towards the god, whose seed they were. For they possessed true, and in every way great spirits, uniting gentleness with wisdom in the various chances of life, and in their intercourse with one another. They despised everything but virtue, caring little for their present state of life, and thinking lightly of the possession of gold and other property, which seemed only a burden to them.